commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please so state at this time. Okay. Hearing none, move on to the minutes. Did everyone have a chance to review the minutes? Any corrections, comments before we vote on a motion, perhaps? Okay. Do we have a motion on the minutes? Commissioner Bailey?
I so move.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Monist. All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Okay, we have one concept on today's agenda, the revisions to Rule 2D.0516, and I believe Brad Nelson.
Brad Nelson with the development branch of the. Thank you. I'm presenting the concept for revisions to O2D 0516. Basically, we want to amend the rule to clarify that the use of supplemental or excess fuel to achieve compliance with the rule is not allowed. To give you a little bit of background, the rule was adopted in 1976. It was part of helping the state achieve the ambient air quality standards for SO2. It was originally 1.6 pound per million BTU for new sources and 2.3 pound per million BTUs for existing sources. In 77, they did some modeling and found out that 2.3 pound per million BTU was adequate for achieving and maintaining standards. So that's where the standard is now. In November of last year, there was a declaratory ruling, I guess, where the commission concluded that the plain language rule does not prohibit the use of the supplemental fuels to meet the standard 2.3 pound per million BTU standard. So what we're intending to do is to revise the rule and provide clarity and consistency with the DAQ's position that the use of supplemental fuel to meet the standard is not a means for compliance. We put a work group together of various DAQ staff and trying to get some ideas on how to revise the rule. Currently, we're working on revising the rule, developing a regulatory impact analysis, and we hope to provide those in July at the AQC meeting. This is just kind of an overview of our timeline and how we see the rule going along. And does anybody have any questions or?
Any questions from the committee? Commissioner Monist.
So my recollection from the last conversation was that it was okay to use supplemental fuel, in your opinion, to use supplemental fuel to increase the heating value, but not more than that to dilute the sulfur pollution.
Well, essentially what they're doing is they're adding roughly about 200 to 300 BTUs to get combustion. What they're doing is going beyond that and actually just increasing the denominator of the values. You do need some fuel in order to achieve combustion. If the waste gas that you're using is will not ignite, I guess. So we're just trying to prevent going beyond that point.
Okay. And are there any other businesses that you're aware of that would be affected by this, or is this really a clarification based on this kind of one instance?
I'm only aware of the one. There's another, I guess, biogas facility. They're using a control. They're controlling the waste gas before it goes to the flare.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have no action items today. However, we do have a presentation on House Bill 951. It's the energy bill. And if we could just get that set up. We have two speakers today who are joining us. We have Christina Kress. She's a partner at the Raleigh law firm Bailey Dixon. She focuses on regulatory matters and energy utilities. And please say whatever else you'd like to say to introduce yourself to the committee. She also was a former staff attorney from the Utilities Commission. We'll also have, after Christina, Peter Ledford, who is the General Counsel and Director of Policy with the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. Thanks to both of our speakers, you have the coveted right before lunch spot. So
Yes,
take no more time. Go ahead.
thank you so much, Madam Chair and Vice Chair Carter, for the invitation to speak with you all this morning. I want to start by just giving you a little caveat that I am not an environmental lawyer. I'm a utilities lawyer who practices energy law, typically over in the Dobbs building at the Utilities Commission. So just want to preface my remarks with that. And due to time constraints, I am going to move through these slides at a fairly rapid clip, but I look forward to answering any questions you might have at the end of the presentation. Session Law 2021-165, otherwise known as House Bill 951, was signed by Governor Cooper into law on October 13th, 2021. And this slide essentially provides an outline overview of what was accomplished, what was set forth in that legislation. Diving right into the heart of the bill, Part 1 sets forth the carbon plan and some carbon emissions reduction requirements. House Bill 951 created a 70% carbon reduction goal by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. That applies to Duke Energy's coal fleet specifically. The emissions that are captured by this legislation are the vast majority of emissions from electric generating units in North Carolina. I don't know the exact percentage, but I've been told it exceeds 90%. Moving on, House Bill 951 directs the Utilities Commission to develop and implement a carbon plan to accomplish the carbon reduction goals set forth in this legislation, specifically the 70% over 2005 levels by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. That process is well underway at the Utilities Commission. There have been a number of robust stakeholder meetings that have already taken place. And actually this coming Monday, May 16th, Duke Energy will file a proposed carbon plan with the Utilities Commission. My understanding is that that plan will contain 4 different pathways or portfolio options for the Commission's review. Interveners, including my clients, the Carolina Industrial Group for Fair Utility Rates, will then have an opportunity to review and respond to the proposed portfolios that will be filed on Monday. Those responses will be due in mid-July, and all of that is going to culminate in a carbon plan that is approved by the Utilities Commission by December 31st of this calendar year. In terms of the North Carolina Utilities Commission's authority in developing a carbon plan, the Utilities Commission must select the least cost resource mix to accomplish the carbon reduction goals in 951. The Utilities Commission must also ensure that changes to our state's electric generation and resource mix maintain or improve upon the existing reliability of our electric grid. House Bill 951 requires that the Utilities Commission review this initial plan that's going to be developed by the end of the year once every 2 years thereafter. That was very intentional, in part because this is going to be presented as a snapshot in time, if you will, and some of the assumptions and the modeling and the data inputs and outputs that will be filed on Monday, will basically become stale and be outdated pretty much the moment that they're filed. So this legislation recognizes the need to be flexible and have this be an iterative plan that evolves over time and takes into account certain changes that may occur, change circumstances, technological breakthroughs, what have you. So there is the potential for subsequent modifications to the plan through this biennial review process that will happen at the Utilities Commission. And the way I like to think about this is House Bill 951 gave us the what. The what is a 70% reduction in carbon emissions over 2005 levels by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. The carbon plan itself is going to give us the how. How do we get to the what that was set forth in this legislation? Moving forward, there's a hyperlink in the presentation, and I would encourage anyone who wishes to learn more about the carbon plan stakeholder process or the development of the carbon plan itself, as well as various parties' positions on what Duke will file. Of course, Duke will file their proposal for a carbon plan in this docket. And I'd encourage you to take a look to learn more information. There's also going to be a slew of public hearings where members of the public will have an opportunity to go and share input and feedback on the proposals that Duke is going to file with the commission on Monday. There will also be virtual hearings for those who may not live in the cities where these hearings will take place. In addition, there are some other opportunities for interested persons to provide input. That being, through participating in the ongoing stakeholder process, which is being facilitated by a third-party entity, Great Plains Institute. Formal intervention, of course, in the docket, which is something that my clients have already done, and they look forward to providing feedback on the portfolios and the pathways that Duke is going to propose on Monday. And then, of course, through submission of written position statements to the commission, either by web or by mail. In order to be responsive to the chair's questions, some of which were already shared with me in advance via email when I received the invitation to come speak, I do want to also talk about existing regulatory processes and how they relate to the carbon plan going forward. So integrated resource planning is something that is required by statute. There's an existing statute that requires the commission to develop an analysis of the utility's long-range needs for expanding or building out new electric generating facilities in our state. And that process has a number of analyses that are undertaken as part of the proceeding that happens before the commission on an every 2-year basis. It happens in even numbered years where a report is filed and then an update is filed in odd years. In terms of what happens at the end of one of those proceedings, it culminates in the commission, the Utilities Commission, issuing an order. It's usually a fairly detailed and lengthy order deciding whether or not to accept the IRP filed by the utility for planning purposes. On this slide, there is a non-exhaustive list of some of the analyses that are undertaken as part of this integrated resource planning process that already occurred before 951 was enacted and will continue to occur going forward. In the interest of time, I won't go through each of these bullet points, but I would encourage those who haven't already done so to read through this list to have a better idea of what the IRP proceedings look at and what the commission is the Utilities Commission is evaluating in that process. This slide contains an example finding or conclusion consistent with, what I previously said in terms of an IRP being accepted as reasonable for planning purposes. And this just shows, some of the ways that the commission will either, make that finding or potentially tweak or modify or place conditions upon that approval. In terms of the enforceability of an integrated resource plan, when a public utility intends to begin construction on a new electric generating facility, it first must file an application with the Utilities Commission for a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, otherwise known as a CPCN. The Utilities Commission will evaluate several factors during the CPCN proceeding, including the cost effectiveness of the proposed generating facility and whether it is necessary to meet our state's energy and capacity needs. The Utilities Commission may also evaluate whether a utility's capital expenditures in a new electric generating facility were consistent with a previously approved IRP in the context of a general rate case. Again, typically the consistency test happens at the CPCN stage, which is a prerequisite that has to occur, a condition precedent before the utility can build out new generation. But there's a second, regulatory process where that may occur and where that may be further evaluated by the commission, and that's in the context of a general rate case. Moving forward, in terms of the CPCN process, the Utilities Commission evaluates whether the proposed next increment of new electric generation is or is not consistent with the most recently approved IRP that the utility has filed and that the Utilities Commission has approved. And if that proposed next increment of new electric generation is consistent with the most recently approved IRP plan, it will be given significant weight as evidence of the need for that new electric generating facility. If, on the other hand, it is not consistent with the most recently approved IRP, the Utilities Commission may rely on the previously approved IRP as grounds for denying a CPCN, and indeed that has on occasion happened in the past. I covered this enforcing compliance or testing for consistency concept already on the previous slides, but for additional information, including what is evaluated by the commission and the statutory requirements for cost recovery in the context of a general rate case, I would encourage you all to read this slide if you have not already. So in terms of how the IRP is going to interact with the carbon plan, I think it's very fair to say that there are a lot of overlapping, duplicative, perhaps, analyses that will be undertaken as part of the carbon planning process. And the commission has acknowledged as much in its orders. Based on a recent order, part of which is excerpted here for you on the slide, the Utilities Commission intends to initiate a rulemaking process after the development of the initial carbon plan this year that will essentially seek to marry the two processes, the IRP process with the carbon planning process. Again, and then it will be on the same or similar schedule going forward with that even number year analysis that will be required again by statute. We'll have to propose essentially a new carbon plan process every 2 years to review the existing carbon plan and determine whether any modifications or a new iteration might be needed going forward. So that IRP and the carbon plan process will essentially be one and the same after that rulemaking proceeding takes place, we expect next year. In terms of the plan for syncing the IRP process with the carbon plan framework, again, I've covered most of this already, but there are a few additional details on this slide. For the sake of time, I will just breeze right through. In addition to the carbon emissions reduction targets that were set forth by House Bill 951, the other major change to our existing regulatory structure that occurred as a result of House Bill 951 has to do with performance-based regulation. This essentially is a brand new, at least to North Carolina and to electric utilities specifically in North Carolina, a brand new regulatory paradigm for rate making and cost recovery here in North Carolina. Part of PBR, that's what those of us who do this work at the Utilities Commission refer to performance-based regulation. Part of PBR includes something called multi-year rate plans, or MYRPs. If approved by the Utilities Commission, this would allow the utility, after a stakeholder process, which will include a technical conference, to use forward-looking test years rather than a historical backward-looking test year to implement essentially a lockstep series of compounding rate increases. So the first year of a 3-year MYRP will allow the utility to request an uncapped rate increase. So there is no ceiling, and the Utilities Commission is not bound by statute to limit the percentage rate increase that can occur in year 1. Year 2, the increase that can be requested and granted by the Utilities Commission is capped at 4% of a utility's revenue requirement. The same 4% cap applies to year 3 as well. Other than MYRPs, PBR also features something called an earnings sharing mechanism, which enables the customers to receive a refund in the event that a utility has excess earnings above 50 basis points. Currently, previously, there was no mechanism for refunding in the event of a utility over-earning. So that is something that is different. Another piece I'll speak to briefly is that PBR authorizes for the residential class of customers the use of a regulatory tool called decoupling. This attempts to break the linkage between a utility's revenues and its sales volume. This then enables the Utilities Commission to ensure that the utilities are receiving fair compensation, regardless of fluctuations in customer load or sales. Proponents of decoupling argue that this will encourage additional investments in energy efficiency measures that perhaps the utilities may not have otherwise been incentivized to undertake without decoupling. Finally, PBR authorizes performance incentive mechanisms, otherwise known as PIMs, which are incentives and penalties depending on whether a utility meets certain metrics in furtherance of one or more policy goals decided by the Utilities Commission. Regardless of whether a PIM is functioning as a penalty or an incentive, PIMs are limited to 1% of a utility's total annual revenue requirement. Moving forward, House Bill 951 also directs the utilities to securitize 50% of the remaining net book value of its subcritical coal fleet in order to achieve ratepayer savings, while also ensuring the utility is made whole for capital expenditures it has made for prior generating facilities. For those who may not be familiar, securitization is a financing tool that lowers costs borne by ratepayers by substituting the utility's rate of return with a low interest rate bond that is paid back over a long period of time. House Bill 951 also directs the Utilities Commission to promulgate rules to implement various other programs, including on-bill financing for energy efficiency measures, targeted to benefit low and moderate income customers. The handout that I gave you is the unredacted or complete rather than snipped version of this chart, which is on the slide. There are several footnotes that are very important in terms of trying to table set and provide context about assumptions made that went into this analysis, which one of SIGFR's technical experts conducted for us when House Bill 951 was undergoing a stakeholder process at the legislature prior to its enactment. Much has been said, at least at the Utilities Commission, about the tremendous upward pressure on electric rates, both now and going into the future for the rest of this decade and beyond. This was true even before House Bill 951 was enacted into law, and it is now even more true after House Bill 951 was enacted. So one of my clients' primary concerns with the implementation of House Bill 951 is going to be continuously the rate impact that this will have on ratepayers' bills. So this handout shows the full version of this graph with footnotes intact, but essentially what you're seeing here on this slide is that for a Duke Energy Carolinas large industrial retail customer, the bill impacts being projected both as a result of House Bill 951 costs and as a result of other programs that were already underway, separate and apart from 951. One of those customers is facing upwards of an 82.5% total projected cumulative rate increase through 2036, which is substantial and incredibly significant. Preceding House Bill 951, you may all know that North Carolina has been implementing the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard, otherwise known as REPS, since the enactment of Senate Bill 3 in 2007. House Bill 951 was not North Carolina's first piece of legislation pertaining to renewable energy and increasing clean energy on the grid. North Carolina was the first state in the Southeast to implement a REPS, and it has now been implemented in over half of the states in our country. REPS requires our state's investor-owned utilities, so Duke and Dominion, to meet up to 12.5% of their energy needs through renewable energy resources or energy efficiency measures. The Utilities Commission oversees compliance with REPS, and the utilities here remain compliant, and the Utilities Commission has oversight authority into that compliance. I mentioned REPS to highlight the significant progress North Carolina has already made in reducing carbon emissions. That is also borne out in this slide that was presented by Duke Energy during one of its stakeholder meetings earlier this year. As you can see from this slide, carbon emissions went down by about 39% between 2005 and 2019, in part due to things like implementation of REPS following Senate Bill 3. Indeed, North Carolina continues to be ahead of the curve with respect to carbon reduction, and that has never been more true than now that 951 has been enacted into law. Moving on now to how all of this connects with RGGI and the proposal you all have pending at the EMC pertaining to the rulemaking petition. I know you all are likely much more familiar with RGGI than I am, so I won't spend time discussing the basics here, except to share a few extra jurisdictional updates that have happened in the past weeks. Pennsylvania just last month promulgated rules potentially enabling it to become the 12th state to join RGGI. Critics say that there are lingering concerns that remain, including a lack of transparency, increased economic costs, harm to industry, and leakages. And I'd like to spend a moment, if I could, talking a little more in detail about leakages specifically, as this is one concern my clients have with the prospect of North Carolina joining RGGI. Leakages can occur in a few different ways. One is by increasing imports of electricity produced outside the RGGI region that results in a net increase in carbon emissions, even if those emissions are not happening here within the confines of North Carolina. The second way a leakage can occur is a shift of generation from regulated to unregulated generators located within the RGGI region. My understanding is that the amount of imports from fossil fuel sources that would occur under RGGI would be greater than without having RGGI in our state, which will essentially have a opposite net impact of, I think, what the intent is behind, reducing overall carbon emissions. Further, my understanding is that if North Carolina were to join RGGI, the carbon clearing price would essentially incent more imports rather than the build out of new renewable energy generation, like would be the case and is going to be the case, I expect, under the carbon plan to meet House Bill 951's goals. So again, most likely those imports would be coming from a region that has a higher carbon intensity in its portfolio of electric generating facilities than we do here in North Carolina among Duke's fleet. This slide contains a table comparing and contrasting some of the similarities and differences between House Bill 951 and the carbon plan, as well as RGGI. And to be honest, I was thinking, as I was preparing last minute preparation this morning, this actually needs a third column, because then you have the sort of RGGI version that was modified, right, by petitioners in this rulemaking petition. And that really deserves its own third column, because we're talking about really three different things here. So in terms of the concerns, we've already talked about leakages being one concern. Again, it's unlikely that if North Carolina were to join RGGI, that it would result in a cumulative decrease in carbon emissions by the end of the decade. Rather, it would potentially have the opposite effect. The second thing I'll note here is that while the what, again, going back to the House Bill 951, created the what is that 70% reduction by 2030. The how is going to be decided by the Utilities Commission through the carbon plan process. But the question of how is currently in development at the Utilities Commission. RGGI represents one potential answer to the question of how, but we believe that the legislature intended for the Utilities Commission to answer that how question through the carbon plan development and implementation process. And it's very possible that the Utilities Commission may consider RGGI as one possible scenario to consider in terms of how we get from point A to point B, which is that 70% reduction over 2005 levels by 2030. I don't imagine that Duke will propose it as one of its 4 portfolios, but I certainly would expect an intervener or two to raise the RGGI issue and response. And so I expect that there will be some consideration of the merits or potentially lack of merits with respect to RGGI as one possible pathway here, one version of a means to an end to get to those 2030 targets. In addition to some of the concerns already noted, some additional concerns my clients have with RGGI is with respect to its broader applicability. It would cover all fossil fuel burning electric generating units, or EGUs, not just those owned and operated by Duke. Again, as I shared earlier, the carbon emissions associated with these EGUs are by and large almost entirely contained within Duke's fleet of generation. Whereas the general rule in other RGGI states tends to be that there's an exemption for industrial cogenerators. There are still exceptions and some alternative compliance measures in those handful of states that do not have that more broad industrial exemption opt-out. So if the proposed rule were to be adopted as written, industrial cogenerators will not only have to pay their share of the cost burden associated with compliance with the carbon plan and 951 carbon reduction targets, they will also have to incur significant costs, both directly and indirectly, related to RGGI. And what do I mean by that? Well, indirectly, their electric rates would go up because this would be a cost adder program. So they would indirectly be footing the bill for RGGI participation because the utilities get to pass through those costs to ratepayers for ratepayers to pay. So they would be paying more indirectly through rates and also directly because they, under the proposed petition as written, they would also be subject to regulation as an emitter under RGGI. With that, I will stop and thank you for your time and offer to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. Now, I cannot imagine there will not be questions for you and some comments, but if I could ask everyone to hold questions until the end after we've heard from Mr. Ledford, and then ask that you just come back up with Mr. Ledford.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Okay. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Peter Ledford. I am General Counsel and Director of Policy for the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. NCSEA is a 501c3 nonprofit that works to drive policy and market development to create clean energy jobs, economic opportunities, and affordable energy for the benefit of all North Carolinians. Ms. Kress, going before me, gave an excellent rundown of everything that is in House Bill 951 and the impacts of the Utilities Commission. I wanted to focus a little bit more narrowly on the differences between the current planning process that we have, the integrated resource planning process, and how things look to be shaping up before the Commission moving forward with the new carbon plan. Just initially, the integrated resource plan has requirements that are codified in statute at Chapter 62-110.1C. In addition, because this has been on the books for 40-odd years, the Utilities Commission has adopted rules to implement the Integrated Resource Plan statute. The carbon plan, in contrast, was passed into law roughly, 9 months ago, and the Utilities Commission has not yet had the opportunity to adopt rules to implement the carbon plan. In light of that, the Commission has said that this initial carbon plan is going to be guided by the existing rules that it has in place for the integrated resource plans. However, they are not going to strictly adhere to those rules. The Commission also said in its order that opened the carbon plan proceeding that in 2023, it will do a rulemaking proceeding to examine how the carbon plan and the integrated resource plans should be melded together in rule. So in a lot of ways right now, the utilities, the Duke utilities, as well as interveners and other participants in the carbon plan proceeding are largely flying by the seat of their pants because there just aren't rules and this has never been done before. I also wanted to highlight that the two planning proceedings really have very different overall goals. The carbon plan is directed at accomplishing these carbon emissions. The integrated resource plan, in contrast, however, is to develop and keep a long-range plan for the expansion of generating facilities. This means that it's looking out into the future. Integrated resource plans by rule go 15 years into the future, and they are examining what plants are planning to be retired, how is North Carolina going to grow, what do we need to do to meet load, how is load going to change, are we going to have hot summers that lead to peaks in the summer afternoon, or are we going to have cold winters that lead to peaks in winter mornings, those sorts of things. So in a lot of ways, they are two fundamentally different planning proceedings. That said, they're not mutually exclusive because you really can't factor the carbon emission reductions required by the carbon plan without looking at those generating facilities and how those are going to be evolving into the future. So that brings me to one of the other major differences, which is that the IRP is completely silent to emissions reductions. The carbon plan does put forward the 70% reduction by 2030 and the carbon neutrality by 2050. This is something that the integrated resource plans are just silent as to. One thing that I also wanted to highlight is the differences in reliability requirements. House Bill 951 is explicit that the Utilities Commission needs to ensure that any generation changes maintain or improve the adequacy and reliability of the grid. The Integrated Resource Plan is largely silent on this issue. However, there are some broader statutes applicable to the Utilities Commission that do set reliability as a priority. So, for example, the Utilities Commission's Declaration of Policy states that we need to have a reliable electric system. And in addition, when regulated utilities come in for certificates of public convenience and necessity to build new generation facilities, they have to show reliability there as well. So there is a slightly different relationship between the two planning processes. In terms of technologies, the carbon plan is very explicit that pretty much everything needs to be considered in the planning process. Everything from generation, the grid, transmission and distribution, grid modernization, energy storage, energy efficiency, demand side management, all of that needs to be considered in the carbon plan. The Integrated Resource Planning Statute is a little bit broader. It only focuses on the need for generation, including reserves and things of that nature. The rule goes into a little bit more detail where it says that the utilities need to consider both supply side resources like generation, but also demand side resources such as energy efficiency and demand side management. Those are also explicitly called out in the carbon plan statute, that those need to be considered. But likewise, the Integrated Resource Planning Rule has adopted requirements for the utilities to consider demand side management and energy efficiency. One of the other major differences that I wanted to highlight is an issue of purchased or imported power. Obviously, North Carolina has different utilities. Duke Energy has its two service territories, Dominion, the various cooperatives and municipalities that provide power. However, they're all a part of a much broader grid, the Eastern Interconnect that goes, roughly covers the eastern half of the country. So they are interconnected, and at times they do transfer power to neighboring states, neighboring utilities, whether it's the TVA in Tennessee, or Santee Cooper in South Carolina, or PJM in Virginia and up north. The carbon plan has no requirements that the commission consider imported and purchased power in determining the carbon plan. However, the Integrated Resource Plan statute and rule both require the commission to consider pooling power and purchasing power from out of state or from other utilities in determining whether that is the most reasonable and prudent way to move forward with obtaining the capacity necessary to serve the state. Finally, there are some differences in stakeholder input. The session law that adopts the carbon plan is fairly vague, but it tells the Utilities Commission that the plan needs to be developed, including stakeholder input. The Commission issued a series of orders directing Duke to hold stakeholder meetings and technical working groups. And the Commission has held multiple conferences to hear from folks associated with the proceeding who are participating in those meetings. So it has been a fairly robust process so far. The integrated resource planning proceeding, however, is a little bit of a lighter touch on stakeholder input. Parties can intervene and participate as legal participants to the proceeding, such as Ms. Kress's clients and my organization. But other than that, it's a single public hearing to solicit feedback from interested stakeholders. So there are some pretty major differences there. And given that Ms. Kress covered the vast majority of the legislation, that's the end of my presentation, and would be happy to take questions.
Okay. If you don't mind staying up there, and Ms. Kress come back up, go around the room for questions. I should mention Commissioner Carter. This is Commissioner Carter's brainchild of bringing this topic forward to the committee. Would you like to make any comments?
Well, thank you. I guess I'm not sure what you were referring to when you mentioned brainchild. I was starting to get a little worried there. Let me address one just confirming question to Mr. Iverzinskis, because it was mentioned earlier, and I just want to make sure we were clear on this. We had a short discussion up at CAPCA about the set of sources that were subject to the RGGI petition, and my recollection is that you and indicated that about 96% of the CO2 emissions would be Duke, and those other sources that are listed in the appendix for the RGGI petition were only maybe on the order of 4 to 5%. Is that, am I remembering accurately?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think it's something on the order of 97% of the emissions come from the investor-owned utilities. And then in the RGGI petition, there are other subject facilities. There are 4 industrial, 1 institutional, 2 cooperatives, 1 municipal facility as well. So, yes, the investor-owned utilities represent approximately 97% or so of the total emissions profile.
Yeah, and in fact, my recollection is if you count up the number of sources in that appendix, or the majority that are listed are in fact the non-Duke facilities, of which none of those are subject to the Utility Commission jurisdiction, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Let me, I guess I'll direct this to Mr. Ledford first. I guess the question I've got, actually, this was most helpful to see the carbon plan and the IRP side by side, at least was for me. And so I guess there are some differences, but is it fair to say they're fairly similar? And there certainly the Utility Commission is certainly positioned to sort of make any adjustments that are needed so that both of those programs work in a common basis going forward.
Yes, sir. I think the commission would be the best one to answer that question, but they have forecasted that they plan to combine the 2 planning processes into a single proceeding that is done every 2 years. So I do expect that in 2023, in their rulemaking proceeding, it's going to be trying to meld the requirements of the 2 statutes into a single rule set and proceeding.
Okay, that's very good. Well, and so if RGGI came along, unless the commission, I guess, decided to adopt some aspect of RGGI, but it was imposed, say, by this commission, you'd have a third layer laid on top of that. Now you've got to make all 3 of those work in some sort of symmetry.
I believe that's fair, yes.
All right. I guess, well, that's all I've got right now. Let somebody else go ahead.
Okay. Commissioner Monist.
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. So as I wish we had the carbon plan already to be able to talk about that, but it sounds like you'll know a little bit about kind of what's coming to a certain extent. So, you know, as Duke is thinking about how to meet these targets, both the 2030 and 2050 targets, in the context of achieving the least cost resource mix, do you know if they're assuming a carbon price?
I believe we'll know on Monday exactly how they're doing the modeling. My understanding is that they're treating it as a carbon cap, as opposed to having a carbon price adder.
Again, you know, I don't think we can answer that definitively until we see the proposal from Duke, and then, of course, the commission, the Utilities Commission has the ultimate say-so in designing that first initial carbon plan. So I don't think we'll have clarity on that question until December 31st, when the Utilities Commission approves the initial carbon plan.
Okay. And one other question, if that's okay. How will complying with the carbon plan affect the pollutants that DEQ regulates, you know, the co-pollutants from energy production that are within DEQ's jurisdiction?
Is that directed at?
Either one of you.
I am a utilities lawyer. I'm not a environmental attorney. So I suspect it would have some impact, you know, both are being emitted from the same source, but I'm by no means knowledgeable on that issue.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously this is an issue that falls within the jurisdiction of several different agencies. So I'm struggling a little bit to see the connection here. And for me, that just points to the need for kind of hearing from the relevant agencies and understanding how these things are woven together. So thank you for that.
And if I could direct the conversation towards Director Representatives.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it very much depends on the makeup of we heard 4 potential pathways. I think that will be included in the draft that's submitted to the Utilities Commission on Monday. The details of those 4 pathways, you know, what mix of coal retirements, what mix of new renewable, what mix of new wind or modular nuclear or whatever, what's that new mix in any one of those pathways will determine the total amount of co-benefits from pollutants, for pollutants other than carbon dioxide.
Okay, that's very helpful, and I would love to hear an update on that once we have more information. And just one other quick thing is, you know, when we were deliberating Reggie, I remember that kind of a main area of concern for our commission was feeling like we didn't really know how the Utilities Commission decides things. And so I really appreciate the context on their decision-making process that gives us that fuller picture. Thank you.
And I think when we were all debating that rulemaking petition, we also realized that there were going to be areas of potential overlap and a lot of details that are going to need to be worked out as we move through that process.
If I could just add
Yeah.
one thing in response to those questions, I think Duke Energy perhaps might be very well positioned to answer those questions and provide even more information and insights once a carbon plan is filed. So this committee or the commission may wish to invite folks from the utilities themselves to come, you know, brief you all on the carbon plan portfolios that they're going to be proposing on May 16th.
Commissioner Deerhick.
Thank you for the presentations. I'll direct this to Director Aprasinskis. How does or will the division interface with the Utilities Commission as all of this is developing? Is there a person designated to be the point of contact for Utility Commission's conversations?
Thank you for the question. We are already interacting with public staff on all of these matters. And so Recent discussions related to 951 are, okay, what's the baseline? What's the 2005 baseline from which the 70% needs to be achieved? And getting some agreement on that as an example. So those are very good, productive discussions between our technical staff and the public staff. And so same thing as we have been discussing pathways on different elements of the fiscal note for the Reggie petition. We would need some assistance from them. I think we've maybe briefed on that, briefly mentioned that before. So there are open lines of communication between our division and the public staff.
Is there one person who's the point of contact, or is it all come to you?
No, ma'am, it does not all come to me. Randy Straight and our team in the planning section are interacting with the staff at the public staff.
Do you believe that you're being included in the conversation well enough at this stage, or that you have an active role in it?
You're referring to the
Utility.
951 process?
And the Utility Commission's planning?
Yes, ma'am. And I feel like we serve as a technical resource for all of these efforts, obviously. So we have some unique skill sets that lend itself to all of these processes. So yes, ma'am.
Chair Smith.
So a couple of questions about implementation and enforcement as this moves along. And I guess a first question maybe for Director Abrazinskis, and then a follow-up question for our guest. And so the first question is, I assume that depending on what that plan looks like, that to the extent there are changes in sources that affect air quality permitting, that then the Division of Air Quality would have to come into that process to revise any permits to reflect different emission limits or whatever the result of those changes. Is that correct?
I think it's reasonable to anticipate that's an outcome of the 951 process. Yes, ma'am.
And so I guess a question for our guest. So my understanding is generally up until this point, for the Utilities Commission, the focus was on the need for generating facilities and then reasonable costs, so rates. And environmental standards were really built into the background of all that. And so environmental standards weren't part of the Utilities Commission process. That was taken into consideration mostly during rate making. And so to the extent utilities had to comply with environmental standards, that got built into the reasonable rate evaluation. Is that a fair statement?
I would just add one little nuance, which is at the beginning of Chapter 62 of the general statutes, there are policy goals and overarching policy considerations that the Utilities Commission is to take into account. And so there are environmental concerns that the Utilities Commission, I think, takes into consideration based on the policy delineations there. But largely, yes, I agree with your summary that the focus is, primarily the need for that new increment of generating plant and then the least cost resource to fill that need.
So one more follow-up question, I guess. And I have skimmed House Bill 951. And I think one question that's likely to come up as things move along is, how will there be adequate tracking and enforcement of these goals? Because my memory is there really aren't new enforcement mechanisms on a year-by-year or 2-year-by-2-year basis. There is an ultimate deadline, and there's some discretion on the part of the Utilities Commission to extend that deadline for certain reasons. But I don't recall seeing anything that would provide a lot of clarity about where we are in that process and holding to specific interim goals or any enforcement mechanism for that. So is there something there that I missed, or is that still fairly vague in terms of how you get from point A to point B and how those reductions are implemented.
So good question. I believe that the legislature's intent was for the Utilities Commission to figure out all of those details. And so I think, the goal was to give the Utilities Commission as much discretion as possible to develop its own carbon plan and to approve that carbon plan this year. And so I expect that the Utilities Commission will have various means by which they will track compliance, and that may take the effect of a reporting requirement in addition to that every 2-year review proceeding at the Utilities Commission. But I certainly expect that those details will be worked out by the Utilities Commission in their order adopting a carbon plan.
The only other thing that I would note is there really aren't any interim requirements. It's the 70% in 2030 and it's carbon neutral in 2050. So we could conceivably see emissions increase in the next couple of years as long as it meets that 2030 goal, as long as they come back down. And yes, there are definitely off-ramps and extensions available to the commission. The commission does have broad authority to compel efficient service from the utilities. So they do have some teeth. There are some teeth that already exist in current law. But I agree that a lot of the reporting and tracking metrics are going to have to be figured out as we move forward.
Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Carter.
Yeah, let me, I guess it's a clarifying question for Ms. Kress and make sure I'm correct on this. The goal or the endpoint for both Reggie and 951 is the same. Am I not correct? 70% reduction by 2030?
So my understanding is that the Reggie states have recently agreed to reduce emissions by an additional 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. So what 951, the target that 951 sets out, actually goes much higher than that. It would require a 52% reduction from 2020 levels by 2030.
Okay, but at least the petition that came to us was set the same 70% by 2030 goal, as I recall.
Yes, that's correct. And again, going back to that slide, I think there should be a third column, right? Because what other Reggie
I
states
agree with you.
do
Yep.
is not necessarily what petitioners have requested in their rulemaking petition.
Yeah. And let me, as a little bit of a follow-up to Mr. Ledford, you were mentioning off-ramps. Are you suggesting, though, that the commission could decide not to make that or design a plan that would meet the 70% by 2030? Is there some sort of an off-ramp that would allow them to go beyond that?
Yeah, the commission has significant discretion. Some things are set forth in statute that if there is an offshore wind project or a small modular reactor that is taking additional time for permitting, they can extend those compliance deadlines. But they also have other abilities to extend or delay the compliance deadlines based on reliability, cost, other sorts of factors.
And so I have a little bit of a different answer to that. Sorry, Peter. But my interpretation is that the Utilities Commission has the authority to extend the 2030 compliance deadline for any reason up to 2032. It can extend beyond that in the event that small modular nuclear reactors or new nuclear or new wind is selected by the carbon plan as a least cost resource for meeting those carbon reduction goals. And the reason for that is quite simply that Duke Energy wouldn't be able to construct those facilities and the transmission needed to interconnect those facilities with enough time to get them brought online and placed into service by the end of the decade.
Okay.
A couple for you. Do you have any sort of sense, this might require a crystal ball, but how this planning process might affect the forecast demands that you might see in the regular planning process?
in terms of customer load or?
As far as I'm an environmental attorney, not a utilities attorney. So my understand of the forecasted demand is it's not just a matter of how many more people might live in the state, but also factor in things like conservation and energy efficiency. So
So this is Christina speaking. I believe that Duke Energy, and again, this might be something that is better spoken to by them directly, but I believe they are seeing trending load growth and increased load over time. And I think that's going to be even more true as electric vehicles continue to grow in terms of market share. I think the projections for the rest of the decade are showing continued increased load growth.
The commission is required to take into account energy efficiency, which can reduce load, and demand side management, which would be things like an air conditioner switch that turns off your air conditioner for 10 minutes on a very hot day, which can reduce that absolute peak load. I think the question is, load is growing. North Carolina is a growing state. We're seeing, vehicle electrification, things like that. So to what extent does that sort of natural growth and the electrification of various things, is that going to outweigh what we could save through efficiency and demand side management? So the commission's going to need to consider both. We do have things that are pushing load to increase, but there's also ways of pushing load down, and it's just going to be a matter of how that falls out, I think.
and then a final question, unless someone else has another. Do you have any sort of sense of how much the already planned coal-fired utility retirements are going to factor into meeting the goals under the plan?
So my understanding is that the 951 retirements are going to be clarified in terms of this is a retirement that is being accelerated ahead of its economic retirement date for the purpose of meeting 951 goals. And so I think it'll be pretty clearly delineated between, whether or not a retirement is happening at its economic retirement date, regardless of what carbon emissions targets were in 951. And then there's going to be those retirements that were fast-tracked and moved ahead of basically to a non-economic retirement date in order to comply with the carbon plan.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none. Thank you for spending some time with us today. This was really helpful to see the process that happens on the Utility Commission side. I know that's not something that's terribly familiar with a lot of folks sitting here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Director Abrazinskis, any comments?
None for today. I will be absent tomorrow at the EMC meeting, so Deputy Director Pajetra will be there to cover, and he'll give all the division updates at that time.
Thank you. Next Air Quality Committee meeting is scheduled for July 13th. It'll be in this room, exact time to be announced. With that, meeting adjourned.